from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, for the last generation, you have a choice.
The Republican candidate
I did
for
not
governor.
have sexual relations with
And I
that woman.
realized that this is something
Miss
he
Lewinsky.
is
We're not going to
inherent.
be able to solve our problems if we get distracted by sideshows and carnival barkers.
One Republican, one Democrat, and you discuss the issues that matter in today's local, state, national, and global politics. Hosted by Steve Hickson with co-hosts John Stanberry and Franklin Chansey. This is Backfire.
Good morning, Cleveland. Glad to be back in here this morning. Good morning, John Stanberry. Good to be back.
Hey, Steve, how are you?
John took a little week off there. Franklin, you think he doesn't look like he got much sun anywhere?
No, he really looks kind of pale, actually.
Anyway,
Probably went to one of those goth conventions or something. Yeah.
No, we have this whole minor little continuing education requirements that we dentists try to keep up with.
oh my goodness, is that they pay you to go to those, don't they?
They do not. We have to pay to do that.
Well, we had Robin Smith in here last week. He did a good job getting someone lined up to come in and fill in for you while he was gone.
Good.
I think I've learned that Franklin tries to be very nice to the girls.
We just have a much more pleasant discussion.
Robin's tough, let's say. Robin's tough.
Well, Franklin and her got along.
We
just
got
fine.
along just fine.
It was kumbaya here while you were gone.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking if they actually discuss politics, that's true. So.
Oh my goodness, where do we start today? Last week we started. I got Robin and Franklin talking about the highlights of the Tea Party, Republicans' extremist agenda. Didn't we talk about that a little bit?
No, I don't think we did.
Or maybe that's
You had a different list.
maybe
You're intrigued by fundraising pitches that parties send out. Well, actually, only Democrat ones are you're intrigued about.
Well, this is what they sent out about the Tea Party and so forth. So, destroy Medicare and replace it with a voucher program that increases costs for seniors. Privatize Social Security and turn your retirement security over to Wall Street. Protect and expand tax breaks for companies that ship American jobs overseas. Block Democratic efforts to raise the minimum wage. Refuse to pass the president's job bill, whatever the hell that is.
Well, that would be probably part of his budget that has never received a single Democrat vote, much less Republican vote.
Wait a minute. I don't even want to get into this morning. I got something I want you guys to hear. Now this, put on your headsets. This is probably this beats it all. This is the ultimate one right here.
The president goes to the Vatican and he says, "Man, we talked about socialism and how great it was, and that's pretty much all we talked about." And the pontiff comes out, the Vatican comes out and says, "No, we talked about religious freedom."
And Obama said it didn't even come up.
And the Pope said we focused on it. Now, which one do you believe?
Well, that old Pope. You can't believe anything he says.
Which one do you believe, Franklin?
I'm waiting for somebody to actually play the quote where Obama came out and said we talked about socialism. Really?
Franklin, all right, let's get beyond.
Come on.
Let's get beyond that. The White House gave a narrative of what was discussed, and it was completely at odds with what the Pope said was discussed. These people can't even tell the truth about the Pope.
Franklin, I'm sorry. I just don't see how an attorney like you can continue to defend someone who is a chronic liar.
Because I don't get my information from the sources that you get it from, and therefore it doesn't appear to me that
Franklin,
he's doing all this lying.
This was covered by the national mainstream media, who's actually very liberal, and they all said the narrative from the White House doesn't match the narrative from the Pope. He can't even tell the truth about the Pope.
When you're lying about a conversation you had with the Pope, you got a problem. I mean, you really got a problem.
Well, I'm waiting for Jay Carney to say the Pope's a liar.
I've just got to be quiet for a minute. That one almost got me when I started hearing this one. Hey, I'll tell you another good one that's coming out right now is Mr. Reed. paying his granddaughter all this money out of his campaign funds. Have you heard that one?
Of course.
Harry Reid. And now he's really upset with the reporters.
Oh, yeah, they shouldn't cover these kind of things.
That enough is enough.
It's an attack on his family.
Mm-hmm. Of course, he didn't tell the truth on that one either. And now they've got it up to $31,000 he gave her. So,
well, did you all see the state senator in California that's been arrested?
Now, what happened?
Well, there's about 4 Democrats that have been arrested in the last couple of weeks, and the mainstream media doesn't seem to want to cover them at all. They've buried all the stories. Now, if it was a Republican, they'd have been all over the news. But the worst one is this state senator Yee in California. Now, he's running for a statewide office. I believe it's not an attorney general, but one of the statewide offices out there. He's been one of the leading proponents for gun control. Yeah. And said that we don't, all us common peons out there don't need to own all these guns. We certainly don't need to own assault rifles. He's been indicted for selling illegal arms, including shoulder-mounted rocket fire launchers, and he's been importing them from the communists in China and from Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist groups and selling them to the Chinese mob. The story is so ridiculous you couldn't even submit it to a Hollywood producer for a script because it wouldn't be believable. And yet CNN actually mocked citizens who asked why they weren't covering it. They said, oh, well, we don't cover state senators' stories. But the amazing thing is they covered Wendy Davis down in Texas when she did her abortion marathon. They covered her night and day. They brought her on as guest. And the real interesting one, if you do a search for State Senator Stacey Camfield from Knoxville, there's a whole page of stories they wrote on him, just on things he said. But yet they can't cover a Democrat who's selling shoulder-mounted rocket launchers to the Chinese mob.
Franklin's been busy looking this up about the Pope.
Here's the actual statement from the Vatican.
Okay.
This morning, 27 March 2014, the Honorable Barack H. Obama, President of the United States of America, was received in audience by His Holiness Pope Francis, after which he met with His Eminence Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State, and Archbishop Dominique Mamberti, Secretary for Relations with States. During the cordial meeting, views were exchanged on some current international themes, and it was hoped that in areas of conflict there would be respect for humanitarian and international law and a negotiated solution between the parties involved. In the context of bilateral relations and cooperations between church and state, there was a discussion on questions of particular relevance for the church in that country, such as the exercise of the rights to religious freedom, life and conscientious objection, as well as the issue of immigration reform. Finally, the common commitment to the eradication of trafficking of human persons in the world was stated. That's the end of the statement.
The problem is the Pope talked about the massive numbers of Christians that are being executed on a systematic basis all over the world that this administration won't even talk about. So the fact that the Pope talked about people being slaughtered, and that doesn't even make it into the White House's description of the conversation, because when the pontiff came out, he said the main thing he was pushing was religious freedom and protection of Christians. And this guy can't even mention that in the statement. I mean, while you're at it, we've got right now, the administration is going to spend $400,000 for a white camel sculpture to put in our Pakistani embassy, because we want to put something in there that's sensitive to the Muslim cultures in that country. $400,000. Now we're running $17 trillion in debt, but we got $400,000 for a white camel sculpture over in Pakistan, so they feel good about, I guess, our sensitivities towards that. At the same time, they canceled a disaster plan drill in Washington, D.C. to plan for terrorist attacks. They scaled it back, turned it into just a little communications check, and as a matter of fact, it was so noticeable that the Al-Qaeda magazine for use actually talked about the fact that they canceled the drill and encouraged use to do street bombs in Alexandria, Virginia, and in Northern Virginia because of the military institutes there. This guy couldn't manage his own to tie his own shoe.
And I want to hear something.
And here is the president's actual description of his meeting with.
Okay. All right, let's hear it.
It's a little bit longer, but this is what he actually says. Okay. This is a quote now.
Now, did he read this from a teleprompter?
I'm sure he did because he's functionally illiterate otherwise, John. Steve, I'm sorry.
Steve, are you?
Okay. Yeah, well, sometimes it's hard to tell you apart. In terms of the meeting with His Holiness Pope Francis, we had a wide-ranging discussion. I would say that the largest bulk of the time was discussing two central concerns of his. One is the issues of the poor, the marginalized, those without opportunity, and growing inequality. And those of us as
Obama's, that wasn't Pope's. Was
and
it?
those of us as politicians have the task of trying to come up with policies to address issues. But His Holiness has the capacity to open people's eyes and make sure they're seeing that this is an issue. And he discussed in the past, I think, the dangers of indifference or cynicism when it comes to our ability to reach out to those less fortunate or those locked out of opportunity. And then we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of conflict and how elusive peace is around the world. There was some specific focus on the Middle East, where His Holiness has a deep interest in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but also what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Lebanon, and the potential persecution of Christians. And I reaffirmed that it is central to U.S. foreign policy that we protect the interests of religious minorities around the world. But we also touched on regions like Latin America, where there's been tremendous progress in many countries, but there's been less progress in others. It goes on talking about a bunch of other issues there.
Does it mention at all the beheading of Christians, which is what the Pope was getting at? They're being murdered. Look, Franklin, when you issue a statement that says persecution, the public doesn't immediately.
The story that was just read was totally false.
No, it's not. This guy plays the game. He is nothing but a talking head.
On some right-wing television show or radio program said that the president talked about socialism, and the Pope wanted to talk about.
I'm sorry, Franklin. That's what redistribution of wealth is. I know you missed that in the definition. But Franklin, when you have a president that has the backbone to stand up and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, that's a powerful statement. When you're having Christians drug out of their homes and beheaded and you go, we need to work on religious tolerance, that's a weak, nothing statement.
He didn't say anything about religious tolerance in that statement.
He said we all got to get along and we've got to work on
conflict. That's not what he said at all.
Guess what, Franklin? Conflict takes on a much more personal tone when some Muslim has a sword at your neck and he's sawing your head off.
That your politics, and the Republican parties for that matter, is so consumed by hatred that you read into every statement.
I asked you this 2 weeks ago, Franklin. Name me one country that we're in a better relationship with now, other than France.
I would say that our relationship with Germany is improved.
Are you kidding me?
Brazil, Chile.
How about little minor countries
Thailand,
like North Korea
Indonesia,
and Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Syria and Libya and some of those little places.
None of whom who have the same governments that we had 5
Franklin,
years
he
ago.
was going to make everything better. He's made it all worse.
Well, you know what? Those countries seem to think that they can affect change democratically in their country. We may not like the outcome, but that seems to me to be a big positive step.
I think 150,000 people that Bashar al-Assad has killed in Syria probably don't consider that democratic. I don't know. Maybe they voted for him to drop a bomb on their apartment building.
I think this past month, for the first time in more than a decade, we didn't have a soldier die in combat. Unfortunately, that's something that you think is tragic for the country.
No, it's not, Franklin. Here's the problem. If the trade-off for a soldier dying in combat overseas is for citizens to die by bombs being blown up in northern Virginia because this guy doesn't even want to hold a counterterrorism drill, here's the words, Franklin. Now, this is actually from the Muslim magazine for youth, Inspire. The magazine urged Muslim youth to attack Americans with car bombs and provided detailed instructions for making the devices from easily available components such as groups of small propane tanks used in cooking grills. This happened after the administration curtailed a counterterrorism drill because we didn't want to offend the Muslims. The guy can't even hold a drill in our own country, much less command any respect in a foreign country.
Tell me about all the terrorist attacks that we've had in America.
Well, I don't know. You had the Boston Marathon attack. You've had all kinds of attacks, Franklin.
Twin Towers.
The Twin Towers didn't happen while he was president.
Franklin, we've
It
had all
happened
kinds
in America.
No, I said while he
said
was
in
president.
America. No, you said
I
in
said
America.
while he was president.
Well, okay, I'm sorry.
Franklin, you've had all kinds of attacks in America. We had Fort Hood, which he labeled a workplace incident. It's not a workplace. The
And
guy
you
went in and shouted Allah Akbar and killed our. And guess what, Franklin? The reason he killed our people on a military base is because the lily-livered liberals won't let our own soldiers carry a gun on base. If they had allowed us to have a gun, a soldier couldn't even have a gun. Somebody would have shot that guy before he killed 14 people.
The lily-livered liberals on military bases who run the bases?
No, that would be the politicians in Washington that make the rules.
The MPs on there don't have guns, John?
Franklin,
really?
All of them should have a gun. We trust them to risk their lives for us overseas. We don't trust an officer
What you
to carry
don't trust is the command of the military to make decisions
Franklin,
for themselves.
I'm sorry, you're right, because guess who
You
the
don't
commander
trust
is?
them.
The
Just say
President
it.
of the United States.
Because,
He's the commander.
Because Wayne LaPierre told you what to think.
Wait a minute. Let's talk about something that
Why don't you
happened
talk
recently.
to Yee, who's selling things out of the back of his car while he's calling for me to be disarmed? Your Democrat buddy out in California is selling to the Chinese mob. You want to fix guns? Fix people like him.
Well, if that's a crime, I say prosecute
If
him.
it's a crime, he's bringing them in from Al-Qaeda terrorists and selling them to the Chinese mob while he's advocating for disarming American citizens, and you have to wonder whether that's a crime?
I don't know if it's a crime. You guys seem to love free markets. You think it's great.
Franklin, this is
The
amazing.
president goes to the Vatican, and he says, man, we talked about socialism and how great it was, and that's pretty much all we talked about.
I just wanted to say that
And this
one
is
more
what
time.
happens,
the
though.
pontiff comes out, the Vatican comes out and
You
says,
turn to sources
no, we
like
talked
this and
about
get your
religious freedom.
information.
Yeah, and Obama said
it's
that
totally
didn't even come
false.
up.
Didn't even
There's
come
not
up.
a
And
shred
the
of truth
Pope
in it,
said we
and people are
focus on
believing it.
Now,
wait a minute,
which
Frank.
one do you
There's
believe?
nothing wrong with being critical of this president, but be critical on
Now,
what
wait
he
a minute.
actually
You-
does
you-
Wait a
instead
minute.
of this stupid
Would you be critical?
nonsense.
Would you be critical of this president
I have
ever?
been.
When?
When?
What about?
Tell me something you've
Anytime.
criticized.
Tell me something. Give me something.
Okay. Number one, I'll give you the low-hanging fruit. The rollout of the website was a disaster. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
Everybody
Well, he
would
couldn't
agree on
help that.
Of course he could.
No, he couldn't, because his wife had to give the contract to her friend,
Yeah, he couldn't help that.
who had already been kicked out of Canadian
Oh,
programs.
great. Here we go again.
But it's okay. Once we took it away from her, we gave her 6 other contracts.
What else?
I think that you can make a reasonably good argument, as John has pointed out over time, that the president's use of that language in Syria about the red line was a mistake. I think that that's fair commentary.
Okay.
I absolutely agree with that.
What about Benghazi IRS or any of these things?
By the way, there's a new study out on that. The CIA officer in the regional director has said that he sent word that there was no local uprising at all. And he sent it before Rice went out and said it was all over a local uprising. But go ahead, Franklin.
Well, I think the fact that we lost 4 personnel.
What difference
in
does it
that,
make? Hillary doesn't think it makes a difference.
The fact that we lost those 4 personnel shows that there was a breakdown in the system. There's no doubt about that.
Well, there's a doubt in Hillary's mind.
No, it's not, John, and that's taking that out of
this
context
point-
what she said, and you know
Guess
it.
what, Franklin? There is
The
no
problem is
there's no context
the
at all
prob- the
that's
problem-
acceptable.
The problem
no
is,
context.
John, that you're incapable
Franklin,
of having a
tell me
discussion
what
about it.
context that's an acceptable statement on her part. Tell
The
me what
context was
what
that the
no,
focus
no, no.
should be on how we solve the problem.
Tell me what context a State Department, the leader, the State Department leader, saying the death of 4 people. What difference does it
That
make?
is
Tell
not
me.
what she said.
She said
John.
those
That's an
words,
outright
Franklin.
lie.
Franklin, did she
Can
say
you
what?
tell the truth,
Franklin,
John? Can
I'm
you do it?
asking you in
That
what.
is not what she said.
Let me put it to you this way. I don't care whether it's a Democrat or a Republican,
don't
Franklin.
care about
that
is
is
getting
not.
the facts right.
There is no context that's ever acceptable. None.
if she had
None.
What
said
difference
that,
does
you'd
it
be
make,
right,
Frank?
and
Hey,
that's not
Franklin.
what she said.
What difference does it make, Franklin?
What she said was it didn't make any difference who wrote the talking points. What
So in
mattered
other words,
was
it
4
doesn't.
people died.
In other words, it doesn't matter how they died because God
it
knows
doesn't matter how they lie.
Franklin, that's my
Wait a
point.
minute.
There is no context that that's an acceptable statement ever.
It doesn't matter how they lied. That's what she was trying to say. It doesn't matter how we lie. That was really what she meant to say.
Until you guys get out of the hole of watching Fox News every morning and getting your views, you can't have a discussion
I
about
swear,
this.
I tried to watch CS, one of your stations the other day.
What is one of my stations?
MSNBC or whatever it is.
Which, by the way, is tanking as we speak.
I don't get my news from MSNBC.
Where do you get yours from?
Well, that's because there's no news on MSNBC.
That's right, John, because it doesn't
I
claim
love
to
Al
be a news
Sharpton's
program.
new show.
Well, Fox doesn't claim on the shows you're complaining about to be a
Oh,
news
really?
show.
That fair
they
and
actually
balanced tagline?
they actually have a news division and they have a program division.
Well, they should do that on
And guess
different
what?
networks.
Hannity is not a news show.
Who's
O'Reilly is not a news show.
I agree with you.
Now, Brett Baer at 6 o'clock is a news show, and so you don't get these kind of
But they
statements
still
out.
claim that they're fair and balanced.
They are fair and balanced because they report
Ridiculous.
things like Democratic senators in California who are selling rocket launchers to the Chinese mob, which CNN has refused to run a single story on. By the way, you know we have going to have a new mayor in Charlotte, don't you?
No, I don't.
Yeah, he's apparently been taking bribes. He's only been in there about 8 months, but he's a good friend of the White House. Matter of fact, in talking to the FBI agent, who he's been under investigation by for 4 years, he sold the idea that he had meetings with the White House and he could sell their project at the White House.
Their
Great
project.
guy.
What project?
Well, they went in and pretended to be real estate developers, and they needed money. And at one point, they set $20,000
He's
in.
being prosecuted.
Yes.
By this administration.
No. By
The
US
FBI works for them.
Franklin, let me explain this to you. It's been going on for 4 years. And while it was going on, he was getting meetings at the White House. And the White House says, well, we didn't know he was being prosecuted.
true. They
And
don't
he's
tell him
selling his influence to supposedly real estate developers. That's not been on the news either. I'm thinking Chris Christie got lots
How
of
did you find
stories
out about it?
because it was on Fox.
Oh, and it wasn't on anywhere else.
No, it hadn't been covered. You know how the AP covered it? They said local mayor indicted. Now, they didn't mention that it's for 20s and 30s and 40s of thousands of dollars and that he was actually selling his influence with the White House. They didn't mention that he's mayor because the former mayor was appointed to the president's staff. Okay. They didn't mention any of those connections.
It took me all of 20 seconds to pull up articles in the New York Times, CNN.
Yep, the New York Times.
The
New York
Observer.
Times did not mention that he was a Democrat, and it was on page 17. Chris Christie's been splashed all over everything. There is such a
Wikipedia, NPR.
Wikipedia, by the way, is the public.
NPR.
Frankly, you're missing the point.
No,
they
point is
don't
it's
even
being covered
label.
by all
They
kinds of
don't
news
even
outlets.
label him as a Democrat. They don't even tell people he's a Democrat. The AP story didn't mention that.
The AP story.
That's where all of this comes from. The AP starts these things usually.
Here it is in the first paragraph of the story on National Public Radio.
Franklin.
My point is, John, it's all over the news.
Franklin, Stacey
Do you
Campfield.
think it wasn't?
Stacey Campfield has an entire sheet of stories that CNN has done on him, and their explanation for not covering the guy selling small arms to the Chinese mafia was, we don't cover state Senate candidates. But our own Knoxville state senator has a sheet full of stories that they covered. Crazy Republican makes weird statement, but crazy Democrat selling rocket launchers to the Chinese mafia, we don't really think that's newsworthy.
Dianne Feinstein's husband is tied to, is tied to a questionable dealings with the U.S. Postal Service.
Yeah, we won't cover that either.
Do you know anything about that, Franklin?
I don't know.
This is old news. It's not new news. Her husband's evidently got the contract to sell all the real estate for the U.S. post offices when they're downsizing.
How many national stories have you seen on Harry Reid? Where do you get your news from?
California State Senator Leland Yee arrested on bribery and arms dealing. This is on CBS.
Yep.
6 days ago.
CNN refused to cover it.
6 days ago.
On bribery and what?
Bribery and arms dealing.
Well, Franklin, do you think they might mention how he had bragged on Piers Morgan, how he had talked about how great his gun control positions were, how he was one of the leading advocates in the state of California for disarming the public? Do you think that's an important connection for the story to make? Does it make all of that clear to people? Or does it just say, well, you know, we had this little bribery thing. It's okay. Don't pay attention. Don't look at the man behind the screen.
I'm just pointing out that you said nobody's talking
Franklin,
about
what
it.
we're talking about is the prominence and the way they play the stories. That gets almost nothing, almost no coverage. Our own Stacey Campfield has more coverage over simple statements that he's made than that guy will get over selling arms to the Chinese mob.
Well, Stacey's statements are awfully entertaining.
You're right, because the liberals don't like what Stacey Campfield says, but they're okay with Yi selling arms to the Chinese mob because he's a good liberal on all the issues. As long as you're a liberal on the issues, we don't care what you're doing in your private life. If you're selling rocket launchers to the Chinese mob, have at it. Just make sure you advocate for taking Second Amendment rights away from regular citizens.
All right. I think since we've gotten so quiet, let's just go ahead and take a break right now. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Backfire with Steve Hickson. We'll be right back after this.
You are listening to WOOP-LP, Cleveland, Tennessee. WOOP FM is a broadcasting service of the Traditional Music Resource Center, and we play America's original music.
You need money overnight? Check into cash. Your time is tight. .com. Bank account's too low? Check into cash. So where do you go? .com. Do it online in a record time. It's the easy way to get money next day. Do a quick click from home.